There's a ditch that runs clear across the state of New York. And if you happen to drive past it today on some quiet back road, you probably wouldn't look at it twice. In some spots, it's narrow. In others, it's gone a little green with algae, framed by old stone and trees that are even older. Kids stop there to skip rocks across the surface. Herons wade through the shallow water on their long, careful legs. To look at it, you'd swear it had always been part of the landscape, the way a river just is, the way a hill just is. But that's the strange part. It wasn't always there. 2 centuries ago, that ditch didn't exist at all. And when men first stood up and said they intended to dig it, the 3rd President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson himself, called the whole notion little short of madness. This was one of the most brilliant minds the young country had ever produced, and he was certain the plan was pure foolishness. He turned out to be wrong, and the story of how a man that intelligent got it so completely wrong, of how a handful of self-taught surveyors and 50,000 workers armed with nothing but shovels and mules carved a path from the ocean straight into the heart of the continent, is one of the quietest and most astonishing tales in all of American history. So settle in, get comfortable, let the lamp burn down low. This is the story of the Erie Canal, and like so many American stories, it begins with a young country that had nearly everything it needed, except a way to move. Before you can understand why anyone would even want to dig a ditch 363 miles long, you have to understand what America actually felt like in those first years of the 1800s. The country was brand new. The ink on the Constitution had barely dried, and the land rolled westward in a way that felt almost without end, forest after forest, valley after valley, all the way out to the Great Lakes and past them. Out there waited some of the richest soil the good Lord ever laid down, farmland finer than most people had ever seen. There were forests thick with timber and hills full of promise. A family could pack up, head west, clear themselves a patch of ground, plant wheat, and grow far more grain than they could ever hope to eat. That was the dream. That was the whole promise of the frontier. But there was a catch, and it was an enormous one. A farmer out in western New York or off in the Ohio country could raise a mountain of wheat and still have no way to sell a bushel of it. There was simply no path to get his harvest into the hands of the people who wanted to buy it. The big markets, the cities, the ports where a barrel of flour turned into real money, all of that sat back east, hundreds of miles off, across roads that hardly deserved the name. Think for a moment about what moving goods really meant back then. There were no trucks. There were no trains, not yet. If you wanted to carry a load of grain from the western farmlands to the docks at New York City or Albany, you had exactly 2 choices, and neither one was any good. You could load everything onto a wagon and drag it overland, but the roads of early America were rutted dirt tracks that dissolved into bottomless mud every spring and every time the rain came down. A team of oxen might cover 10 or 15 miles on a good day, and good days didn't come along often. Wagons broke, axles cracked, the animals wore themselves out, and the whole time the grain sat there in the damp, slowly starting to spoil. Or you could try the water route, floating your goods down whatever river happened to run nearby. But the rivers never went where you needed them to.
they flowed the wrong direction, or they dropped off into waterfalls, or they simply gave out in some swamp miles from anywhere useful. The real barrier was the Appalachian Mountains, that long spine of highland running down the eastern side of the country, sealing the coast off from everything inland. Those mountains weren't especially tall as mountains go, but they were wide and they were rough, and for 200 years they'd held the American people pressed up against the Atlantic like water penned behind a dam.
The numbers say it plainer than any description could. To move a single ton of goods from Buffalo way out on the shore of Lake Erie all the way down to New York City by road cost somewhere around $100 and ate up the better part of 3 weeks. $100 in the money of that time was a small fortune. It was often more than the goods themselves were worth, which meant that a farmer in the West might as well have been growing his crops on the moon for all the good his surplus did him. He could feed his own family, and he could feed the neighbors down the road, but the wider world stayed out of reach. So he stayed poor, the West stayed empty, and the country stayed pinned against its own eastern edge, unable to grow into the vast inheritance sitting just on the far side of those mountains. Something had to give. Somebody had to find a way through, or around, or over the top. And so the ideas started to stir, softly at first, in the minds of a few dreamers who looked hard at the map of New York and saw something everyone else had missed.
Here's the thing about the geography of New York that made all of it possible. The Appalachian Mountains run in a nearly unbroken wall from the deep south up through Pennsylvania and on into New York. But at one single spot, and only one, there's a gap. The Mohawk River Valley cuts a low, gentle passage straight through the highlands, tracing the course of the Mohawk River as it runs westward from the Hudson. It's the one place along that entire mountain chain where you could travel from the eastern coast toward the Great Lakes without having to haul yourself over anything truly punishing. Nature had left a door open, just barely cracked, and for the longest time nobody had thought to walk through it. But now people were starting to notice. If you could follow the Hudson north from New York City up to Albany, then somehow keep pushing west through that Mohawk Gap and carry on across the flat country beyond, you might, just possibly, reach Lake Erie. And once you reached Lake Erie, you reached everything. The whole interior of the continent opened up to you. The Ohio country, the Michigan country, the endless West, all of it suddenly tied to the ocean by one unbroken ribbon of water.
The first man to see this clearly and to shout about it until people listened wasn't a politician or an engineer. He was a flour merchant named Jesse Hawley, and his part in this is one of those small human oddities that make real history so much richer than the versions you get in school books. Hawley had gone bankrupt trying to ship grain across the state, brought down by the very transportation problem we've been talking about. His business fell apart, his debts piled up, and he ended up in a debtor's prison, which was exactly where a man landed in those days when he couldn't pay what he owed. But Hawley didn't just sit there and rot. Locked in that cell, turning the same problem over and over in his mind, the one that had ruined him, he started to write. Between 1807 and 1808, using a pen name, he published a whole series of essays laying out in remarkable detail the case for building a canal all the way across New York from the Hudson to Lake Erie. He described the route, he worked out the costs, he argued it could be done, and that if it were done, it would transform the entire nation. And he did all of it from behind the bars of a debtor's prison, a broken man dreaming up a waterway he would never make a dime from. It's one of the quiet ironies of this whole story that the grand vision of the Erie Canal was first written down in full by a man who'd lost everything he had for the lack of it.
Hawley's essays landed in front of some powerful people, and none more important than the man who'd become the beating heart of the whole project, a New York politician by the name of DeWitt Clinton. Clinton was a big, commanding figure, ambitious and proud, sometimes downright arrogant, but he carried a real and burning belief that this canal was the future of his state and his country. He served as mayor of New York City and later as governor of the state, and he threw the full force of his considerable political skill behind the idea. Convincing everyone else, though, was another matter entirely. When the plan was carried to the federal government, first to President Jefferson and later to President Madison, the reception ran from cool to openly mocking. Jefferson, as we've said, called it little short of madness. And honestly, you can see why. Look at what was actually being proposed. At that point in history, the longest canal anywhere in the United States stretched maybe 27 miles. The men pushing the Erie Canal wanted to build one that ran 363 miles, more than 13 times longer than anything that had ever been tried on American soil. It would have to cross rivers, it would have to climb hills, it would have to slice through forests and swamps and solid rock, and it would have to do every bit of that in a country that didn't have a single trained engineer to its name.
Sit with that for a second, because it's one of the most astonishing facts in the whole affair. When the leaders of New York made up their minds to build the most ambitious engineering project the nation had ever attempted, they went out searching for engineers to design it, and they found there weren't any. The United States in those early 1800s didn't have one single school of engineering. There was no place anywhere in the country that taught a man how to survey a route, how to figure the grade of a slope, how to build a lock that could lift a boat from one level of water up to another. So the canal commissioners did what desperate people always do. They tried to bring engineers over from Europe, where that knowledge actually existed. But the Europeans were either too busy, were too costly, or simply had no interest in crossing the ocean to gamble their reputations on what looked to them like a reckless scramble through the American wilderness. One after another, the offers came back declined, and that left the commissioners in an impossible spot. They had a vision of a canal, they had the first stirrings of political support, and they had absolutely nobody qualified to build the thing.
What they did next was so bold it should have collapsed 100 times over. They turned to a small handful of local men, every one of them an amateur, and asked them to work it out. The two chief engineers of the Erie Canal, the men who'd end up responsible for laying out its entire course, were named Benjamin Wright and James Geddes, and neither of them was an engineer. They were lawyers. What little they knew about surveying hadn't come from any classroom, but from handling land disputes, from walking property lines and measuring boundaries while settling legal quarrels between one neighbor and the next. That was the full extent of their expertise.
Working alongside them was a scattering of other self-taught men, a few green surveyors, and at least one fellow who had been, of all things, the local mathematics teacher. These were the people who would design a waterway longer than any in the entire Western Hemisphere. They were figuring it out as they went, teaching themselves on the job, learning a profession that didn't even exist yet in their own country. And the remarkable part, the almost unbelievable part, is that they got it right.
There was one problem in particular that seemed at the start to have no answer at all. And the way they finally cracked it tells you everything you need to know about the kind of ingenuity this project would demand. A canal isn't just a ditch full of water. To actually work, it needs locks, those clever chambers that raise and lower boats between different water levels, letting a vessel climb a hill or ease down into a valley. The idea of the lock was ancient. Leonardo da Vinci himself had sketched out designs for them hundreds of years before. But to build a lock, you needed one very particular kind of cement, a substance called hydraulic cement, which had the almost magical ability to harden even while it sat underwater. Ordinary mortar would just wash away or crumble to nothing beneath the surface, but hydraulic cement set as hard as stone even inside a flooded chamber. The trouble was, the only place to get it was Europe, and shipping it across the Atlantic and then hauling it inland would have cost a fortune the project didn't have.
The man who finally solved it was a young assistant to Benjamin Wright, a fellow named Canvas White. White had been sent over to England for a year, walking the towpaths of the great British canals, studying their locks, filling notebook after notebook with everything he could learn about how the work was really done. When he came back to America, he threw himself at the cement problem. Together with a colleague, White started experimenting with local limestone, burning it and grinding it and testing whatever came out. And after a great deal of trial and a great deal of failure, he stumbled onto a discovery that would rescue the entire project. He found that a certain kind of limestone, sitting in plentiful supply right there in the hills of New York, when properly ground down and burned, produced a lime that could be turned into hydraulic cement, cheaply and in almost unlimited amounts. It was a breakthrough worth more than gold. It meant the 83 locks the canal would eventually need could all be built from materials dug straight out of the same ground the canal was cutting through. In its own quiet way, it stands as one of the great moments of American invention, and hardly a soul alive today has ever heard the name Canvas White.
And so, against the mockery of presidents and the doubts of very nearly everyone, the great work was finally ready to begin. The state of New York, unable to pry any money out of the federal government, made the extraordinary choice to pay for the whole enormous thing itself, borrowing the funds and staking the credit of the entire state on the belief that the canal would earn its cost back many times over. The critics sharpened their knives. They called it Clinton's Folly, after the governor who'd championed it. They called it DeWitt's Ditch, a nasty little rhyme, as though the whole endeavor were nothing but the vanity of one proud man. Newspapers scoffed. Rival politicians forecast disaster and financial ruin. And out along the planned route in the little towns and scattered farms of central New York, ordinary folks waited to see whether this really was the dawn of something brand new, or just the opening act of the biggest embarrassment their young state had ever suffered.
The day they picked to start was the 4th of July in the year 1817. There was a certain poetry in that choice, naturally. The 4th of July was the nation's birthday, the anniversary of independence, and to break ground on that particular morning was to declare that this canal, too, was a kind of declaration all its own, a statement about what a free and determined people could pull off. And the spot they chose was a town called Rome in central New York, on a stretch of fairly flat and forgiving ground, where the first inexperienced crews could learn their trade before they faced the harder trials waiting down the line. And so, on that summer morning, with speeches and ceremony, and no doubt a good deal of nervous hope in the air, the first shovel bit down into the earth, and the digging of the Erie Canal began. But not one soul standing in that field on the 4th of July truly grasped what they'd just set in motion. They didn't know it would take 8 long years. They didn't know they'd have to invent, out of sheer necessity, machines and methods that had never existed before, strange contraptions for pulling down trees and tearing out the deep-buried stumps that choked the forest floor. They didn't know how many men would come across the ocean to swing the picks and haul the mud, or how many of those men would sicken and die in the fever-ridden swamps along the way. They didn't know that the hardest miles of all, the ones that would nearly break the whole enterprise, were waiting far off to the west, where a wall of solid rock stood between the diggers and the shining waters of Lake Erie. All of that lay ahead of them, unknown and unimagined, on that first ceremonial morning. For now there was only the field and the shovel and the loose brown earth turning over in the summer sun, the very first small wound in the ground that would one day become the waterway that changed a nation. The men who came out to dig the Erie Canal were, most of them, exactly the kind of people history tends to overlook. They left no grand portraits behind, and precious few of them ever wrote letters that made it down to us. But they were the ones who actually built the thing, foot by muddy foot. And if you want to find the real heart of this whole story, it's with them. At first, the work fell mostly to local men, farmers from the countryside nearby, who signed on for wages during the stretches of the year when their own fields could spare them. It turned out to be one of the smartest features of the whole project, whether anyone planned it that way or not. A farmer could spend his summer digging on the canal, pull in some hard cash, which was a rare thing out on the frontier, and still make it home in time to bring in his own harvest. The money the canal paid out found its way into thousands of pockets up and down the route, and that money moved through the little towns nearby and helped breathe life into them long before a single boat ever floated down the finished channel. But local hands alone were never going to cut it. A ditch 363 miles long, dug entirely by muscle and sweat, called for an army of workers, far more than the sparsely settled country of central New York could possibly provide on its own. So the canal turned into one of the first great magnets for immigrant labor in American history. Men crossed the ocean from Wales, from Germany, from other corners of the Old World. But more than anywhere else, they came from Ireland. This was still years before the terrible potato famine that would eventually push the Irish toward America by the hundreds of thousands. But even back then, in the 18-teens and 20s, hard times and poverty at home were already sending Irishmen across the Atlantic in steady numbers. Many landed at the East Coast ports with nothing to show for themselves but a strong back and a willingness to take on brutal work that most other people wouldn't touch. And there wasn't work more brutal or more plentiful than digging that canal. The pay wasn't much, somewhere around 50 cents a day in the early years, though it shifted depending on the times and how tough the ground happened to be. Often the men got more than just wages, too. They had a place to sleep, rough as it was. They were fed, and they were handed a daily ration of whiskey. That last part might sound odd to us now, but on the Canal, whiskey was every bit as much a part of the deal as the shovel in a man's hands. The usual practice was to pass out several small pours across the day, a jigger to start the morning, another around midday, more still in the afternoon and evening. The men running the crews believed it kept the laborers working hard through the heat and the cold and the misery, and the workers themselves had come to expect it as simply part of the arrangement. By any fair account, this was a hard drinking enterprise from one end to the other, and the whiskey ration was just one more strange thread in the fabric of canal life.
Now, when people picture the digging of a canal, they usually think of men shoveling dirt, and sure, there was plenty of that. But the very first task, and often the hardest one, had nothing to do with dirt at all. It was the trees. Much of the canal's path cut straight through dense, untouched forest, the kind of old-growth woodland that had stood undisturbed for hundreds of years. Before anyone could lift a single shovelful of earth, all of that forest had to come down. The trees needed felling, and worse than that, the stumps and their deep, twisted roots had to be torn clean out of the ground, because there was no digging a canal through a tangled mess of buried timber. Pulling stumps by hand, one at a time, would have taken a lifetime, and the men working on the canal simply didn't have a lifetime to spare. They had a deadline and a state watching their every move.
And here's where one of the quietly remarkable parts of this whole story comes in, because the men of the Erie Canal did what practical, self-taught people have always done when they run up against an impossible task. They invented their way through it. Nobody was selling the machines they needed because those machines didn't exist yet. So the workers and the men supervising them built their own, right there on the job. They came up with a special plow, heavier and tougher than any plow a farm would need, pulled by teams of oxen and built to slice through the thick tangle of roots hiding beneath the forest floor. They also built an enormous stump puller, a great wheeled machine of massive wooden wheels and chains, 16 feet across, that a team of animals could crank to rip a full-grown stump straight out of the earth, roots and all. By some accounts, that machine could clear 30 or 40 stumps in a single day, work that would have taken men with axes and shovels weeks to finish. Nobody remembers who designed these homemade contraptions, and they never became famous, but without them, the canal might never have been finished at all. And they stand today as proof of the plain, stubborn ingenuity of ordinary working people staring down a problem nobody had ever solved before.
Once the forest was cleared and the stumps were gone, the real digging got underway, and this was where the canal truly earned its grim reputation. The channel needed to be 40 feet wide at the surface, tapering down to 28 feet at the bottom and 4 feet deep, and every bit of that had to be carved out by human hands and animal muscle. Men worked with shovels and picks and wheelbarrows, breaking up the earth, loading it, hauling it away, hour after hour, day after day, in a rhythm of labor that seemed to have no end. In the summer heat, the sun beat down on them, and dust rose up in choking clouds. When the rains came, the whole excavation turned into a soup of mud that grabbed at their boots and made every load twice as heavy to carry. It was back-breaking, monotonous, dangerous work, and the men stuck it out because they'd come a long way and didn't have many other choices, and because at the end of every brutal day there was pay waiting, and food, and somewhere to lie down.
But of all the hardships the diggers faced, nothing was more feared or deadlier than the swamps. For all the planning that went into the canal's route, it couldn't dodge certain stretches of low, wet, waterlogged ground, and the worst of them by a wide margin was a place called the Montezuma Marshes, a vast, dismal wetland sitting in the central part of the state. Digging a canal through a swamp is a nightmare all on its own, with water constantly seeping back into anything you try to dig out, and the ground shifting beneath your feet. But the real danger there was invisible. The marshes bred mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes carried disease. Workers came down with what people back then called swamp fever and the ague, an illness that hit with violent chills and burning fevers that shook a man right down to his bones. We know now that a lot of this was malaria, though nobody at the time understood what caused it or how it spread. All they knew was that the swamps made men deathly sick.
What happened in those marshes is almost hard to put into words. During the worst stretch, sickness tore through the labor camps like wildfire. Men fell ill by the dozens and then by the hundreds. The work slowed to a crawl, and in some places it stopped altogether because there simply weren't enough healthy men left to lift a shovel. Some accounts describe more than 1,000 men lying sick at once along that fever-plagued section of the route, and a great many of them never got back up. We don't have exact numbers on how many workers died building the Erie Canal because nobody back then bothered keeping careful records on the lives of poor immigrant laborers. But the toll in those swamps alone was severe, with the sick and dying laid out in makeshift camps far away from home and family. It's one of the sobering truths hiding underneath the triumph of the canal, that the waterway, which brought so much prosperity to so many people, was paid for, in part, with the lives of the forgotten men who dug it.
While the diggers were battling the forest and swamps, other men were wrestling with the challenges of engineering, and here, too, the canal called for feats that had no precedent anywhere in America. Water, as everybody knows, doesn't flow uphill, and it won't sit still on a slope either. A canal has to stay for long stretches perfectly level, and wherever the land climbs or drops, that difference in height has to be handled with locks. Between the Hudson River at Albany and the surface of Lake Erie out at Buffalo, the land rises a total of roughly 568 feet. All of that climb had to be conquered one step at a time through a series of locks, and by the time the canal was finished, there were 83 of them strung along its length. Each lock was a stone chamber with heavy wooden gates on either end. A boat would enter through one gate, that gate would swing shut behind it, and water would either flood in or drain out until the boat had risen or dropped to match the next stretch of canal. Then the far gate would open and the boat would move on. It was a simple enough idea in principle, and a demanding thing to build in stone 83 separate times across 363 miles.
The engineers, keep in mind, were largely teaching themselves as they went along, and their successes were genuine. But there's one structure along the canal that deserves special mention because it left everyone who saw it astonished, and it stands as proof that these self-taught American builders had truly come into their own.
To carry the canal across the Mohawk River, the engineers had to build an aqueduct, which is just a bridge that carries water instead of a road. Picture a great stone bridge marching across a river on a row of arches, except running along the top of it, held inside a watertight stone trough, is the canal itself, boats and all, gliding through the air above the river below. There were actually 2 such crossings of the Mohawk, and the great aqueducts, one of them stretching well over 1,000 feet across more than 24 stone arches, were counted among the engineering wonders of their age. People traveled long distances just to stand there and watch a boat sail serenely across the top of a river, and it's not hard to see why. There was something almost magical about it. Water carried over water, a thing that seemed to defy plain common sense, and yet stood there solid and dependable in the sunlight.
Section by section, as each finished stretch of the canal was completed and filled with water, it opened up to traffic, even while the rest of the great project pushed forward. This was another piece of the project's quiet brilliance. The builders didn't wait for the whole canal to be finished before they started earning money from it. The very first section to open ran through the flat middle country of the state, the easy ground where the least experienced crews had gotten their start. And from the moment the water flowed in and the first boats showed up, it was a runaway success. Toll money came pouring in. Farmers who'd never before had a way to move their grain suddenly had a cheap, easy highway of water running right past their fields. Little towns along that finished stretch began to swell and prosper almost overnight, and every dollar collected in tolls on the completed sections went toward paying for the sections still being dug, so that the canal, quite literally, started funding its own completion. The mockery around Clinton's folly grew quieter with every passing month, since it got harder and harder to laugh at a ditch that was already turning a serious profit. Yet, even as the middle sections thrived and the doubters went quiet, everyone tied to the canal knew the hardest test still lay ahead, out at the western end, where the flat, forgiving country gave way to something else entirely. There, standing between the diggers and their goal of Lake Erie, was a great ridge of rock, a natural wall of stone running across the land, and beyond it a stubborn shelf of the hardest limestone the workers had come up against yet. To reach the waters of Lake Erie, the canal would have to be cut straight through solid rock, driven deep into the bones of the earth itself, in an age with no dynamite, no power tools, nothing mechanical capable of breaking stone. How a handful of self-taught engineers and their weary, whiskey-fed laborers managed to conquer that last barrier, armed with little more than black powder, hand drills, and sheer stubborn will, is the next part of our story, and it's a tale worth staying awake for, just a little while longer.
The last great obstacle of the Erie Canal was waiting near a place that would eventually be called Lockport. And to really understand why it nearly broke the men who faced it, you have to picture the land out there in western New York. As the canal pushed toward Lake Erie, that flat, forgiving country in the middle sections gave way to a long, high ridge of rock called the Niagara Escarpment. It's the same great shelf of stone that, a little further west, sends the Niagara River plunging over the edge to form the falls. Out there, it stood like a natural wall cutting across the countryside, and right where the canal needed to pass, the land shot up sharply, some 60 feet or more. There was no skirting around it. The ridge ran too far in either direction for that. The only way to lift the canal from the lower ground up onto the higher plain beyond and finally on toward Lake Erie was to go straight at it, straight through it.
The challenge really split into two massive problems, and either one alone would have counted as the hardest thing the canal builders had ever faced. The first was simply hauling boats up and over that 60-foot climb. You can't exactly ask water to climb a wall, and a single lock could only lift a boat a few feet at a time. So to beat a rise that steep, the engineers came up with something the country had never seen before, a great flight of locks, stacked one right above the other, letting a boat climb the escarpment step by step, almost like it was walking up a giant staircase made of water. 5 locks made up the flight, and because they expected so much traffic, they built the whole thing twice, side by side, a double flight of 10 locks total, one line for boats heading west, another for boats heading east, so nobody going opposite directions would ever have to sit around waiting. Once it was finished, that combined flight at Lockport became one of the real marvels of the canal. This massive staircase of stone and water climbing straight up the ridge, and travelers would stop and stare at boats slowly rising and sinking through the chambers, like the land itself was lifting them by hand. But finishing the locks was really only half the fight at Lockport, and if you can believe it, that was the easier half. Once a boat made it to the top of the escarpment, it still had to cross westward over the high ground toward Lake Erie, and that's where the workers ran straight into the toughest stretch of the entire 363 miles. People came to call it, plainly enough, the Deep Cut. For about 7 miles past the locks, the canal had to be hacked straight through a ridge of solid rock, hard limestone and dolomite, some of the most stubborn stone anywhere in New York. And it wasn't a shallow job either. In some spots, they had to cut down through more than 30 feet of unforgiving rock just to keep the canal level. 7 miles of solid stone, 30 feet deep, dug out completely by men who didn't have a single tool we'd consider necessary for a job like that today.
Here's the detail that should really stop you cold, the one that makes the Deep Cut one of the most jaw-dropping feats in the whole history of American building. The men cutting through those 7 miles of bedrock had no dynamite. It wouldn't even be invented for another 40-some years. No steam drills, no pneumatic hammers, no machines of any kind to help chew through the stone. What they had was black powder, plain old gunpowder, plus hand tools and their own stubborn strength. And the process was every bit as slow and dangerous as it sounds. A man would grip a long iron drill, hold it steady against the rock, and pound it again and again with a heavy hammer, twisting it slightly after every strike, boring a hole down into solid stone through nothing but sheer repetition. Just drilling one hole deep enough to matter could eat up hours. Then they'd pack the hole with black powder, run a fuse, and set off the charge to crack and loosen a section of rock. And once the smoke cleared, the shattered stone still had to be hauled out by hand, carried up out of that deepening trench before the whole grinding cycle started right back up again.
That constant blasting is what made the Deep Cut not just hard, but genuinely lethal. Black powder is unpredictable, even dangerous in skilled hands, and these were laborers, not trained experts, figuring out the risks as they went. Accidents happened constantly, and they were often brutal. Charges blew before men could clear the area, fuses burned faster than expected, and worst of all was the ever-present danger of flying rock.
When a charge went off down in that narrow, deepening channel, it sent stone fragments shooting in every direction, sometimes launching chunks high into the air that came crashing back down without any warning at all. Workers were killed by falling debris more than once. Some stories tell of rocks blown so high and so far that they landed on the town growing up above the cut, putting the very people settling there at risk too. Every single day, the men of the deep cut worked under a real threat to their lives, and plenty of them paid for it with everything. Like so many who died building this canal, their names were never written down anywhere. But the stone they died cutting still carries the canal to this very day. As if the danger from the powder wasn't enough on its own, the deep cut fought the men in another way too. The deeper they dug, the more they had to deal with water seeping up from underground, pooling from rainfall with nowhere at all to drain. The men often ended up working in cold, standing water, hauling broken rock while soaked clean through, the excavation constantly trying to fill itself back up, even as the crews fought to empty it out. Eventually, the engineers had to design pumps and drainage systems just to keep the cut workable at all. From beginning to end, it was a fight against the earth on every single front. Against the hardness of the rock, against the danger of the powder, against water that just kept creeping back in, and it wore these men down, and it took years to finally win. The town of Lockport itself grew up right alongside this enormous struggle, and its story says a lot about how the canal reshaped everything it touched. Before construction, there was almost nothing out there, just wild land, rock, and a handful of scattered settlers. But the second the work on the locks and the deep cut kicked off, people came pouring in. Laborers needed somewhere to sleep, food to eat, drink to ease their sore bodies, and merchants and tavern owners and tradesmen showed up fast to supply it all. A rough, booming, brawling frontier town sprang up almost overnight, its whole future tied directly to the rock being carved open right beside it. That pattern played out again and again along the canal's path, but at Lockport it hit especially hard. An entire community summoned into being purely by the difficulty of the job. A town born out of rock, powder, and endless human labor. A huge share of the toughest work at Lockport, like so much of the canal, fell on Irish laborers. By this point in construction, Irish immigrants made up a large part of the workforce, and they carried much of the most dangerous, back-breaking labor, including a lot of the drilling and blasting down in the deep cut. Their willingness to take on such risky work for modest pay is really what made finishing the canal possible at all. And yet what they usually got in return was suspicion and scorn, rather than any real gratitude. There was a strong current of anti-Irish, anti-Catholic sentiment running through the country at the time, and it followed these workers wherever they went along the canal. Established residents looked down on them, blamed them for the drinking and rowdiness swirling around the labor camps, and treated them as outsiders, even while they poured their sweat and often their blood straight into the ground. It's one of those recurring sorrows in American history, newcomers doing the hardest work of building the country while getting held at arm's length by the people already settled there. And the Irish laborers on the Erie Canal understood that reality as well as anyone ever has. The conditions these workers lived through at Lockport and everywhere else along the line would honestly horrify us today. There were no safety rules of any kind, no compensation if a man got hurt on the job, nothing set aside for the widow and kids left behind after a worker was killed by falling rock or swamp fever. If a man got hurt badly enough that he couldn't work anymore, he was simply let go. The contractors running the labor cared a lot more about cutting costs than looking out for their crews. There are records of workers cheated out of wages they were promised, charged unfair prices for food and a place to sleep by the very people employing them, docked pay for days lost to rain, and left with a lot less money in their pockets than they'd ever been told to expect. The relationship between the men digging the canal and the men profiting off it was, more often than not, deeply unfair, and the laborers had almost no power to push back. They worked because they had no other choice, and they endured what they had to endure, and the great waterway rose up out of their labor, whether the world ever bothered to thank them or not. And still, through all that hardship and injustice, the work kept moving, and slowly, almost impossibly, the western stretch inched toward completion. The flight of locks at Lockport rose stone by stone until that massive double staircase stood finished, ready to lift boats straight up the face of the escarpment. The deep cut pushed forward, foot by exhausting foot, driving west through the last stretch of bedrock, the trench growing longer and deeper as months turned into years, until finally the end came into view. It's worth pausing here to really sit with the sheer stubbornness this took. Years of daily labor with hand drills and black powder, injury and death piling up along the way, a constant battle against water and rock and pure exhaustion, all carried by men who had no idea just how big what they were building really was. They weren't working for glory. Most of them were just working for their daily wage and their daily meal. But together, without even realizing it, they were pulling off something that would echo through the entire future of the country they'd chosen to call home.
By the summer of 1825, the impossible was nearly finished. The last of the rock had been cleared, the final locks completed, and the entire length of the canal, from Albany all the way to Buffalo, was finally joined into one continuous navigable waterway. 8 years had gone by since that first ceremonial shovelful of dirt back in Rome. 50,000 men, by most estimates, had swung the picks, hauled the mud, drilled the stone, and in far too many cases, given their lives to get it done. Self-taught engineers had bridged rivers with aqueducts, climbed the land with 83 locks, and cut straight through solid rock where nobody thought it could be done. What President Jefferson had once dismissed as little short of madness, what newspapers had mocked as Clinton's folly and DeWitt's ditch, now stretched complete and gleaming clear across the width of New York State, just waiting for the water to fill it end to end, and for the very first boat to make that triumphant journey from the Great Lakes all the way to the sea.
And DeWitt Clinton, the man who'd staked his entire career and reputation on this canal, the man whose name had been turned into a punchline by everyone certain he'd fail, was still right there, still governor, still standing, finally ready to have the last word. The state that had funded this entire project alone, betting against its own future while a laughing nation looked on, was about to find out whether that enormous gamble had actually paid off. Preparations began for a celebration unlike anything this young country had ever seen.
a spectacle built to announce to the whole world that the Erie Canal was finished, open, and that this so-called impossible ditch was now simply a fact of life. How they celebrated the canal's opening and what happened to the state and the nation once boats finally began moving along its waters, that's where our story picks up next.
When the Erie Canal finally reached completion in the fall of 1825, DeWitt Clinton and the people of New York felt that a simple ribbon cutting and a handful of speeches just wouldn't do the moment justice. They'd built the longest canal anywhere in the Western world, and they'd done it in a country that, only 8 years before, hadn't had a single trained engineer to its name. Naturally, they wanted the whole world to know it. So they came up with a celebration so grand, so clever, that people are still talking about it 200 years on, an event that came to be known as the Wedding of the Waters. The concept itself was lovely in its simplicity. Since the canal now linked the waters of Lake Erie all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, they decided to carry a keg of that lake water clear across to the sea and pour it in with great ceremony, symbolically marrying the two together, joining the heart of the continent to the wider world in one graceful gesture.
The whole journey started up in Buffalo, right on the shore of Lake Erie in the last days of October. Governor Clinton and a group of dignitaries climbed aboard a boat called the Seneca Chief, bringing along 2 beautifully carved wooden kegs filled with water straight from the lake. The boat pushed off, heading east along the canal, pulled by horses plodding along the towpath, with New York City waiting more than 500 miles away by water. But honestly, the boat wasn't even the cleverest part of the celebration. That honor belonged to how word of its departure raced ahead of it. The organizers had lined up cannons all along the canal and down the Hudson River, stretching from Buffalo to New York City, each one placed close enough to hear the last. The moment the Seneca Chief pulled away from the dock in Buffalo, the first cannon fired. Down the line, the next crew heard it and fired their own gun in reply. And so it went, cannon after cannon, the sound hopping down the entire length of the state. Just stop and think about what that really meant. In a time with no telephones, no radios, no telegraphs, no way to send word any faster than a horse could gallop. That chain of cannon fire was, without question, one of the fastest long-distance messages America had ever seen. The sound made its way down the whole canal and along the Hudson to New York City in about 80 minutes. And then, in a wonderful twist, they fired it all again in reverse, sending the news right back up to Buffalo. So that within just a few hours, word of the canal's opening had traveled clear across the state and returned. For anyone standing outside listening to those guns roll past one after another, fading into the distance, it must have felt like something enormous, a wave of sound announcing that life as they knew it had just changed for good. The Seneca Chief's trip turned into one long triumphant parade from start to finish. As it moved east and then down along the Hudson, it passed through town after town where people lined the riverbanks to cheer. Bands struck up music, speeches went on, and bonfires lit up the October night. Every single community along that route understood exactly what the canal meant for their future, and watching the governor's boat go by felt like witnessing the start of something new. Day after day, the Seneca Chief kept moving, picking up more boats as it went, the celebration growing bigger the further it traveled, until finally, in early November, it reached New York City and the open Atlantic.
There, in front of massive crowds, and with all the pomp anyone could ask for, Governor Clinton lifted one of the kegs from Lake Erie and poured it straight into the ocean, completing the wedding of the waters and officially opening the canal to the world. It was a moment of pure vindication for a man who'd spent years being ridiculed, and he'd more than earned it.
But grand celebrations always fade, and cannon smoke drifts away eventually. The true worth of the Erie Canal was never going to be measured by one spectacular day, no matter how magnificent. The real story, the truly astonishing part, unfolded afterward, once the boats actually got to work, moving up and down the finished waterway. Because the canal didn't just succeed, it succeeded beyond anything even its biggest believers had dared hoped for. And it happened almost immediately, reshaping the economy of an entire state, and, before too long, the fate of the whole nation.
Remember those brutal numbers we talked about earlier? The staggering cost of hauling goods across the state by road. Shipping a single ton of freight from Buffalo to New York City overland used to run around $100 and take weeks of grueling travel. Once the canal opened, that same ton could make the trip for somewhere around $10, and later, as things got more efficient, even less than that. The cost of moving goods across New York dropped by 90% or more, and the time it took fell just as sharply, from weeks down to mere days. This wasn't some small improvement, it was a revolution in the truest sense, a shift so massive and so sudden that it completely rearranged the economic life of the entire region almost overnight.
The ripple effects spread out in every direction imaginable. Farmers out in western New York, and soon enough those in the Ohio country and beyond, who'd never had a way to profitably sell their extra grain, suddenly discovered they could ship it cheaply and quickly straight to New York City, and from there out to markets around the world. Farmland in the interior that had been nearly worthless simply because there was no way to reach a buyer suddenly became incredibly valuable. Wheat, flour, salt, lumber, all sorts of goods started flowing east along the canal in a tide that just kept growing. And heading the other direction, manufactured goods, tools, cloth, finished products of every kind flowed west, carried cheaply into the interior to supply all those growing settlements. The canal turned into a two-way river of commerce, and the wealth it produced was staggering to witness.
Think about the tolls alone for a moment. New York had borrowed a massive sum, somewhere around $7 million, to build the canal, and skeptics were certain the debt would sink the state. Instead, the tolls collected from boats using the canal paid off that entire debt in roughly a decade. And after that, the canal became pure profit, pouring money into the state treasury year after year. What people had mocked as Clinton's folly turned out to be one of the smartest public investments in American history. The canal didn't just pay for itself once, it paid for itself over and over, funding roads, schools, and countless improvements across New York for generations afterward.
And yet, even with all that toll revenue and trade, remarkable as it was, that's still only part of the story. The deepest impact of the Erie Canal showed up in how it shaped the growth and settlement of the whole country. The canal threw open the door to the American interior in a way nothing before it had ever managed. Now that a family could travel cheaply and in reasonable comfort by boat from the East Coast all the way to Buffalo and Lake Erie,
and from there push onward into the Western territories, the great wave of migration into the interior sped up dramatically. Settlers poured westward along the canal by the tens of thousands into western New York, into Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and lands even further out. The canal became the main highway of American westward expansion during those years, the route that carried a huge share of the nation's growth. Towns and cities sprang up all along its path and at its far ends, and the whole center of the country began filling up with people, farms, and enterprise far faster than it ever would have without that ribbon of water leading the way. And there was one city above every other whose fortune the canal secured, and that city was New York City itself. Before the canal, New York City was certainly an important port, but it was just one among several rivals along the eastern seaboard, all competing with Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and others for the young nation's trade. The Erie Canal changed all of that decisively and for good. Because New York City sat right at the mouth of the Hudson River, and the Hudson connected directly into the canal, New York suddenly became the single great gateway linking the entire interior of the continent to the sea. All that flood of goods pouring out of the west along the canal passed straight through New York on its way out to the wider world, and everything arriving from Europe and elsewhere passed through New York on its way inland. Its rivals simply had no way to compete. None of them had a water route through the mountains into the interior, so none of them stood a chance.
Almost overnight, New York City turned into the busiest, richest, fastest-growing port in the entire country, and it never slowed down from there. The canal transformed it into the commercial capital of the nation, the great engine driving American trade and finance, and set it firmly on the path toward becoming one of the most important cities anywhere in the world. It's really not an exaggeration to say that the towering, restless, endlessly ambitious New York City we know today owes its very existence to that unlikely ditch dug across the state by immigrant laborers and self-taught engineers. The water quietly moving along that canal was, in a very real sense, the same water that lifted New York toward greatness.
The transformation reached all the way down into ordinary people's daily lives, too, in both big ways and small ones. Goods that had once been rare and costly out in the interior became cheap and common almost overnight. Families who'd lived in near isolation out on the frontier suddenly found themselves connected to the broader currents of the country. Ideas, newspapers, letters, and travelers moved along the canal just as easily as freight did, weaving the far-flung corners of the young nation more tightly together. In that way, the canal became more than just an economic marvel. It turned into a unifying force, too, a thread of water helping to stitch a sprawling young country into something that felt more like one people, at a time when the whole thing could easily have drifted apart into strangers.
The Erie Canal's success was so total, so undeniable, that it set off a wave of imitation all across the country. Watching what New York had pulled off, other states rushed to dig canals of their own, hoping to capture some of that same explosive prosperity for themselves. What followed became known as the Canal Boom, or Canal Mania, as state after state borrowed money and dug new waterways, connecting rivers and lakes in imitation of New York's triumph. Not every one of those later canals succeeded, and a few actually ruined the states that overreached trying to build them.
But the impulse behind all of it traced straight back to the astonishing example the Erie had set. For a brief, remarkable stretch of time, the canal stood as the very symbol of progress in America, the technology that seemed to promise a golden future of connection and commerce. And it all started with that single bold ditch cut across New York.
The men who'd learned their craft building the Erie Canal, teaching themselves engineering with an axe in one hand and a surveyor's chain in the other, became an incredibly valuable national resource in their own right. People started saying they'd graduated from the Erie School of Engineering, even though no such formal school ever actually existed. These men carried their hard-earned knowledge forward, lending their skills to the canals and railroads and massive public works that would define the next chapter of American growth. The canal hadn't just moved goods and people from place to place. It had created, out of ordinary lawyers and math teachers and laborers, the very first generation of American civil engineers, and their influence would go on shaping the country for the rest of the century. That same year the canal was being built, an actual school of engineering, one that would eventually grow into the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, was founded up in Troy, New York, right alongside the Great Waterway, almost as if to make official the lessons the canal had already taught.
So the Erie Canal had triumphed in every way imaginable, economically, symbolically, and in how completely it reshaped a nation's destiny. The mockery turned to marvel, the folly turned to fortune, the ditch turned into a highway of commerce that redrew the map of American life. And yet, as with everything built by human hands, the canal's story didn't just end there in glory and stay frozen in place. Even at the height of its success, forces were already gathering that would one day challenge its supremacy. New technologies coming over the horizon that would eventually leave it behind. The canal itself, so wildly successful that it quickly grew overcrowded, would have to be rebuilt and expanded and reimagined in the decades ahead. What became of the Erie Canal from there, how it climbed to even greater heights before slowly fading, and what's left of it in that quiet waterway you might drive right past today, that's the final chapter of our story, and it feels like the right place to bring this long journey to a close.
The success of the Erie Canal brought with it a problem its builders never could have complained about. The canal was too popular. Within just a few years of opening, that waterway, which once seemed impossibly ambitious, began to feel tight and overcrowded, choked with far more traffic than it had ever been built to handle. The original canal, you'll remember, was fairly modest in size, just 40 feet wide at the surface and 4 feet deep, sized for the small boats and humble expectations of the men who first carved it out. But the wave of commerce that poured onto it after 1825 grew far beyond anything they'd pictured. Boats piled up at the locks, jams formed along that narrow channel. The very canal that had solved the great transportation puzzle of its time now strained under the weight of its own success, a victim, in a way, of just how well it had worked.
So New York did the only thing that made sense. Having built one great canal, the state set out to build an even bigger one, essentially reconstructing the whole waterway in place while somehow keeping it running the entire time. This first major enlargement began in the 1830s and dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Crews widened the channel from 40 feet to 70 and deepened it from 4 feet to 7, so far larger boats hauling much heavier loads could move through it. They rebuilt the locks bigger, doubling them where they hadn't been already, so boats could travel in both directions without sitting and waiting. In many stretches, they straightened and improved the route itself,
smoothing out the sharp bends and clumsy sections of the original for a faster, easier passage. By the time this enlargement wrapped up around the middle of the century, the Erie Canal had practically been reborn, a stronger, mightier version of itself, capable of carrying the swelling commerce of a nation growing faster than anyone had dared imagine.
And still, the traffic kept growing. Through the middle decades of the 1800s, the Erie Canal stayed one of the great arteries of American commerce, moving enormous volumes of goods and quietly playing its part in the country's vast expansion. It's worth remembering that all of this unfolded during some of the most turbulent years in the nation's history, through the fierce growing pains of a young republic and straight on into the Civil War and its aftermath. Through it all, the canal kept working, kept hauling grain eastward and manufactured goods westward, kept feeding the growth of New York City and the settlement of the interior. It had woven itself so deeply into the ordinary rhythms of American life that people barely thought about it anymore. It was just there, doing its job, the way a river is simply there, much like we said back at the beginning of this story.
But even while the canal labored on through its middle years, a new force was rising across the American landscape, one that would eventually overshadow the canal completely. That force was the railroad. In those very same decades New York spent enlarging its great waterway, iron rails were being laid across the country, and the steam locomotive was proving itself the transportation marvel of a brand new age. The railroad carried advantages the canal simply couldn't match. A canal could only run wherever water could be coaxed to flow, and it froze solid each winter, shutting down completely for months once ice sealed the channel. A railroad, though, could climb hills and cut through land no canal could ever hope to reach, running in every season, even through the depths of winter when the canal sat frozen and silent. And in the end, a train was just faster. A trip that took days by canal boat could be covered in mere hours by rail. For a good stretch of time, the canal and the railroad ran side by side, each hauling its share of the nation's goods, with the canal still holding its ground for heavy, bulky cargo like grain, lumber, and coal, where low cost mattered more than speed. But the long-term trend was unmistakable, and it moved in only one direction. Year after year, the railroads spread, improved, and multiplied, and year after year they siphoned off more and more of the traffic that once traveled by water. The canal never disappeared, but its old dominance slipped away bit by bit, passing to those tireless iron engines that could go where water couldn't and keep running when the canal couldn't. The very waterway that had opened up the American interior was, little by little, being outpaced by the same restless spirit of invention it had helped set loose in the first place.
Even so, New York wasn't quite ready to hand its great canal over to the railroads without a fight. And so, in the early years of the 20th century, the state launched one final massive transformation of the waterway. Sometime between 1905 and 1918, the old Erie Canal was rebuilt once more thoroughly than ever before, into what became known as the New York State Barge Canal. This time, engineers did something the original builders could hardly have dreamed up. Instead of keeping the canal as its own separate channel running beside the rivers, they widened and deepened the natural rivers themselves, the Mohawk among them,
folding them directly into the canal system, so that in many stretches the modern canal now ran right through what had once been untamed river. This new waterway was far bigger and deeper still, engineered for powered barges rather than horse-drawn boats, and much of the old hand-dug channel from 1825 was simply left behind, going quiet as traffic shifted onto the new route. And that, in a way, is how we end up at the sleepy, half-forgotten ditch we mentioned way back at the start. When the canal was rebuilt into the barge canal, long stretches of the original Erie Canal, the very channel 50,000 men had once dug by hand, were simply abandoned. In some places they were filled in and paved over, swallowed whole by the growing towns and cities the canal itself had helped bring to life. In other places they were left to nature's slow patience, the water going still, banks overtaken with grass and reeds, old stone locks quietly crumbling into ruin among the trees. The mighty commercial artery of the 19th century faded over the long stretch of the 20th into a quiet relic, its heroic beginnings forgotten by nearly everyone who lived right beside it.
The canal's commercial life wound down eventually to almost nothing. As highways and trucks joined the railroads through the 20th century, the last freight that once moved by water drifted off toward faster, more flexible ways of shipping. By the later decades of the century, barely any commercial cargo traveled the old canal system at all. The great waterway that had once carried the wealth of an entire continent had, for all practical purposes of trade, gone quiet. And yet it didn't die. Instead, the canal found a gentler second life, no longer as a highway for commerce, but as a place for recreation and remembrance. Today, the surviving stretches of the Erie Canal and its successor carry kayaks and pleasure boats instead of grain barges, and the old towpaths where mules once trudged along, hauling boats at the end of long ropes, have become peaceful trails for walkers and cyclists winding through the New York countryside.
Much of the canal's original route and its rich history have been carefully preserved, so the story we've been telling wouldn't be lost completely. There are places today where you can stand beside the restored flight of locks at Lockport, that great stone staircase carved through the escarpment where men once drilled and blasted through solid rock using nothing but black powder, iron tools, and their own bare hands. There are stretches of the old hand-dug channel preserved exactly as they once were, and museums that tell the stories of the diggers, the mule drivers, and the self-taught engineers who made the whole thing possible. The heron standing quietly in the shallows and the children skipping stones across the still green water are enjoying, without ever knowing it, one of the most consequential pieces of ground in all of American history, a place where the future of a nation was quite literally dug out of the earth.
It's worth pausing here at the end of our long journey to think about just how much came from that one improbable ditch. When Thomas Jefferson called the idea little short of madness, he was, by the standards of his own time, entirely right. It shouldn't have worked. A country with no trained engineers, no engineering schools, no dynamite, and no machines had no business carving a 363-mile waterway through forest, swamp, and solid rock. And yet it worked, and in working, it changed nearly everything. It turned New York City into the commercial capital of the nation. It threw open the American interior to settlement and helped fill the heart of the continent with people, farms, and towns. It slashed the cost of moving goods,
tied together the far corners of a young country, and set off an entire era of building and connection that carried America into the modern age. Few single works of human hands have ever accomplished so much, and even fewer have done it while being mocked every step of the way.
But maybe the part most worth holding on to as we bring this story to a close isn't the tolls or the trade or the transformation of great cities, remarkable as all of that truly was. Maybe it's the ordinary men themselves, the ones history so nearly let slip away. The farmers who dug through the summers just to earn a little scarce cash. The Irish, the Welsh, and the Germans who crossed an entire ocean and poured their strength, sometimes their very lives, into fever-ridden swamps and deadly rock cuts, all for 50 cents and a ration of whiskey a day. The self-taught lawyers and math teachers who invented an entire profession as they went along, who bridged rivers with aqueducts, climbed the land with locks, and simply refused to believe it couldn't be done. They built no monuments to themselves. Most of their names were never even written down. But they left behind a ditch stretching across the state of New York that changed the course of a nation. And every quiet mile of still green water remaining today stands as a memorial to their labor, whether anyone passing by remembers it or not.
And so the water settles, and the herons wade, and the old locks stand crumbling and patient among the trees, holding on to the memory of 8 impossible years and 50,000 forgotten hands. The next time you find yourself on some quiet back road in upstate New York, and you cross a narrow, unremarkable stretch of green, drowsy water, you'll know now exactly what you're looking at. Not just a ditch, not just a relic, but the very waterway a young, restless country dug straight through the wilderness with its own 2 hands, back when almost no one believed it could be done. It's a good thing to carry with you into sleep, this thought of quiet water and patient stone, and of the ordinary people who once upon a time moved a mountain of earth and rock and changed the world, then finally lay down to rest, their great work finished at last, the water flowing gently on without them, just as it flows tonight. That brings our story to its close. Rest well.